Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been working on pipeline repairs in the Trans-Alaska system for 9 years, and people who've never done this job always ask the same questions. They wonder about the cold, about seeing the northern lights, and whether grizzly bears really roam the work areas like they show in videos. What they never ask about is the silence. Ultimately, what affects you isn't the temperatures dropping low enough to freeze diesel fuel, or the darkness that swallows everything for months on end. It's that absolute silence you feel when you're 40 miles from the nearest person and the wind finally stops. My name is Ryan Keller, and I perform troubleshooting, maintenance, and repair work on the 60-mile section between Pump Station 7 and Pump Station 8. It's a solitary job, and it suits me perfectly. It always has been. I spend most of my shifts driving a modified Toyota pickup truck along service roads, stopping every few miles to check pressure gauges, inspect fittings, look for freeze damage, and make sure the heating elements wrapped around critical sections are working properly. The pipeline in this section is usually above ground, supported by vertical support elements resembling giant metal H-beams driven into the permafrost ground. In summer, the tundra spreads out in all directions like an uneven green carpet. In winter, there is only a white void, except for the dark line of the pipe curving towards the horizon. February is the worst month. The sun barely rises above the horizon and quickly sets again, leaving you with perhaps 4 hours of dim twilight to work. On a warm day, the temperature hovers around -30. When polar air masses from the north press in, it drops to around -50. Your breath instantly crystallizes, forming ice on exposed skin, and if your vehicle breaks down more than a mile from shelter, you might have an hour before hypothermia starts making decisions for you. This particular rotation began routinely. I was assigned a standard 5-day shift covering my usual section, and was staying in one of the prefabricated maintenance cabins the company had distributed along the road every 32 kilometers. These huts are simple but functional, just a bunk bed, a propane heater, maybe a half-working satellite phone, and insulated metal boxes containing enough freeze-dried food to last 2 weeks if you're careful. The hut assigned to me for this shift was designated MSH 47 and was located roughly in the middle of my section, near the 312-mile marker. The first day was routine. Starting at the southern end near the 7th pump station, I worked my way north, checking every gauge and valve. The pipeline pressure remained steady at 800 psi, within normal operating parameters. The oil was flowing at a rate of about 4 miles per hour, and the temperature remained steady at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit to maintain its fluidity. Everything seemed to be in order. I took my notes, flagged a few minor issues to address before the next inspection cycle, and reached MSH 47 around 3 in the afternoon as daylight faded. When I arrived at the cabin, it was freezing inside, which was to be expected since no one had been there for 2 weeks. I turned on the propane heater and waited for the interior to warm up enough that I could take off my outer clothing without risk of freezing. While the heater was running, I used the satellite phone to connect with base. The connection was choppy, full of digital glitches that occur when the signal bounces off the satellite too much, but I confirmed my location and gave my first report. Everything was normal, no issues to report. The next check was tomorrow evening. That first night, I made instant coffee, ate a meal that claimed to be beef stew but tasted like salty paper, and reviewed my equipment checklist for the next day. Outside, the wind had picked up. The cabin was shaking slightly, and I could hear the constant low-frequency hum of the pipeline as the oil flowed through it. If you work in this environment long enough, you become unaware of the sounds. Just like people who live near train tracks stop hearing the freight trains passing by at midnight. I fell asleep at 8 o'clock, which was early even for me, but the isolation and constant darkness disrupt your circadian rhythm and you feel perpetually tired. I woke up at 2 in the morning to use the chemical toilet, and that's when I first noticed something strange. The hum of the pipeline had changed. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle shift in tone that my brain picked up before I was fully awake. I stood in the dark for a minute, listening, trying to figure out what was different. The sound was slightly louder, as if someone had revved the engine up a few RPMs. Probably just pressure fluctuations, I told myself. This always happens when the temperature drops rapidly and the metal contracts. But it bothered me so much that I put on my thermal suit and went outside to check the nearest measuring station, about 200 meters from the cabin. The cold hit like a punch, that momentary shock causing you to involuntarily inhale and immediately regret taking that breath. The stars were shining, millions of stars, so bright they cast shadows on the snow. The northern lights were dancing too, green and purple wavy curtains, playing across the sky as if they were living things. The measurement station was a small metal enclosure mounted on one of the support elements and contained analog pressure and temperature readings used as a backup to the digital monitoring system. I cleared the ice from the glass surfaces and checked the numbers. The pressure was 790 psi, 10 below the expected value. It wasn't a huge drop, still within an acceptable range, but it was unusual at this time of day when demand is typically low, and the pressure should remain steady or even rise slightly. I wrote a note in my logbook, took pictures of the measuring devices with my phone's camera, and returned to the cabin. The wind had completely died down, and the absolute silence I mentioned earlier had returned. There were no animal sounds, no rustling of plants, just the hum of the pipeline and my own breathing. With every step I took, my snow boots crunched beneath me, and I could hear this sound echoing across the tundra, as if announcing my presence to everything listening in the darkness. After that, it was difficult to sleep. I kept thinking about the pressure drop, going over possible explanations. There could be a leak somewhere downstream, but the monitoring system would have flagged it. There could be increased flow at one of the pump stations, but that usually happens during daylight hours when actively managing output. It could be nothing, just a normal fluctuation that I was overthinking due to isolation in the strange hours. The second day began with another gauge check, and the pressure had risen back to 800 psi. Whatever caused the drop had corrected itself, bolstering my thermal contraction theory. I spent the morning moving north along my section, stopping at each support element to inspect the welds and check for any signs of stress. The work was monotonous but necessary. If you miss a crack as thin as a strand of hair, that crack can lead to a catastrophic failure, spilling thousands of barrels of crude oil onto the tundra and turning your career into a cautionary tale told in training sessions. At noon, I stopped for lunch in a wide area along the service road where I could see the pipeline stretching out in both directions perfectly clearly. I was eating a granola bar and drinking hot coffee from my thermos when I saw something and dropped the cup, grabbing my binoculars. About half a mile north on top of the pipeline, on the metal, was something dark, about the size of a person. I focused the binoculars and felt my stomach churn. It was as if someone was standing on the pipeline, nowhere, just standing still. There were no vehicles nearby, no equipment, no logical reason for anyone to be there. I watched for maybe 30 seconds, my brain trying to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the figure moved. Not to walk or climb down, just shifted its position slightly, then remained motionless again. I put the truck in gear and drove toward that spot. my eyes never leaving that figure. As I got closer, maybe a quarter of a mile away, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a caribou, somehow up on the pipeline, standing on the curved metal surface as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This made no sense. The pipeline, supported by the vertical elements I mentioned, extended about 1 to 5 meters above the ground in this section. A caribou couldn't have jumped up there, and even if it somehow had, it would have been impossible for it to stand on the curved surface. I stopped the truck about 100 meters away and went outside with my binoculars again. The caribou was definitely real. I could see its breath forming clouds in the cold air and its ears twitching. But its legs weren't in the right position, as if it were standing on a flat surface instead of a curved pipe. And it wasn't moving constantly, alert and ready to flee, as caribou normally do. It just stood there, facing south along the pipeline, completely motionless except for occasional ear movements. I honked the horn a few times, thinking the sound might scare it and reveal the mystery of how it maintained its balance. The caribou turned its ears toward me, but made no other movement. It didn't shift its weight, turn its head, or show any expected startle response. I honked again, this time longer, and that's when things got even stranger. The caribou slowly, deliberately tilted its head until it was looking directly at me. It wasn't looking in the general direction of the truck, but specifically at me through the windshield, as if it could pinpoint my exact location. We stayed like that for maybe 10 seconds, locked in this strange staring contest. Then the caribou turned and began walking north along the pipeline. Its claws made no sound that I could hear, and its gait was strange, too smooth and fluid for an animal walking on a narrow, curved surface. I watched it through my binoculars until it reached the next support pole about 40 meters away. Then it climbed down from the pipeline and disappeared behind the structure. I headed toward that support pole as fast as the icy service road would allow, but when I got there, the caribou was gone. I got out of the car and searched the entire area for tracks in the snow. There were none. None on the ground. None leading to or from the pipeline support. Nothing. The snow around the support element was completely undisturbed except for my boot prints. I even climbed onto the support structure to check the top of the pipeline, thinking I might find some evidence of the animal there, some scratches on the protective coating or compressed frost marks. The surface was spotless. Despite my quality gear, the wind pierced through my layers as I stood on the pipeline, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe it was a visual illusion, some kind of mirage caused by the temperature inversion and the angle of the weak sunlight. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my brain was filling in details that weren't really there. But I knew what I had seen. I had watched that caribou for at least 2 minutes through a good pair of binoculars from different distances. It was real. The rest of the second day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I continued to check the mirrors, continued to scan the pipeline in both directions, waiting for that caribou to reappear. When I returned to MSH 47 that evening, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. I reported my daily report to dispatch, taking care to keep my voice steady and professional. Everything was normal. The pressure was stable. There were no maintenance issues requiring urgent intervention. I didn't mention the caribou. What could I say? That I saw an animal standing in the pipeline in a physically impossible way and then disappearing without a trace. They would subject me to a psychological evaluation and perhaps permanently remove me from my duties. So I kept it to myself and tried to convince myself it wasn't important. That night, the pressure dropped again. Around midnight, I was lying in my bunk, not quite asleep but not fully awake either, when I noticed a change in the hum of the pipeline. I checked my watch and noted the time, then got dressed and went to the outdoor measurement station. This time, it was 780 psi, 20 lower than normal. The temperature gauge read 138 degrees, which was also slightly lower. I took photos and noted everything in my logbook, then made a decision I'd been avoiding. I was going to call the dispatch center and report the pressure irregularities. It was probably nothing, but if there was a leak somewhere in my section, it was better to catch it early rather than wait for it to become a crisis. I went back to the cabin and grabbed the satellite phone, but before I dialed the number, I heard a sound outside that froze me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow, circling the cabin. I dropped the phone and listened, trying to pinpoint the location. The steps were heavy, definitely not a fox or a ptarmigan, and there was a steady rhythm suggesting purpose rather than random wandering. They made a full circle around the cabin and then stopped at the door. I waited, almost holding my breath, my hand on the can of bear spray I kept near the entrance. The footsteps neither retreated nor advanced. Whatever was outside was standing right in front of the door, and now I could hear it breathing, slow and raspy, like someone who had run a lot and was trying to catch their breath. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer. The breathing continued, steady and rhythmic. I considered opening the door, but my instincts protested. Instead, I went to the small window next to the entrance and looked outside. There was nothing there. The area right in front of the door was empty, just pristine snow glistening faintly in the starlight. But I could still hear the breathing, very clearly, coming from exactly where someone would be standing outside. I pressed my face against the cold glass and watched for a full minute, and the breathing never stopped or changed its rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. I stayed at the window for another 10 minutes, watching for any movement, but I saw nothing. Then, gathering my courage, I opened the door slightly and scanned outside. Still nothing. There were no footprints other than the ones I had left earlier. No sign of anything near the cabin. Sleep eluded me for the rest of that night. I sat on the bunk with my back against the wall, waiting for dawn. Bear spray in one hand, phone in the other. Around 3 in the morning, the hum of the pipeline returned to normal, the pressure probably up to 800 psi, but I didn't go outside to confirm it. The third day started gray and cold, clouds from the north signaling a storm. I went through my morning routine on autopilot, ate some instant oatmeal, and checked my equipment. My hands were shaking a little as I loaded the equipment into the truck, and I looked at the snow around the cabin, searching for footprints I knew I wouldn't find. The workday passed in a blur. I checked my control points, examined my sections, took my photos and notes, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about breathing, about that caribou, about the drops in pressure that happened just when I was most vulnerable. Unpleasant patterns were forming, connections that my rational mind rejected, but my instincts insisted were real. At 2 in the afternoon, with the dim daylight already beginning to fade, I was examining a valve assembly about 30 miles north of the cabin when I found the first handprint. The handprint was pressed into the frozen crust on the pipeline, at chest height, fingers splayed wide. The print was larger than my own hand, and its edges were still fresh enough not to have evaporated away. I looked around, hoping to see another maintenance worker, perhaps someone from the 8th pump station doing spot checks in my section. But there were no other tire tracks in the snow besides mine, no footprints leading to or from the pipeline. Just that single handprint, perfectly preserved in the ice, the palm and fingers clearly defined. My heart pounding in my chest, I took photos from various angles. Then I looked further down the pipeline and saw another handprint about 10 feet away, and another one beyond that. There was a series of prints extending northward at equal intervals, as if someone had walked alongside the pipeline, trying to keep their balance by holding onto the metal pipe with one hand. But there were no footprints on the ground. There were no tracks in the snow, only handprints visible at regular intervals on the frozen ground. I followed them for about 50 meters, documenting each one, until the print suddenly ended. The last print was no different from the others, perfectly clear and detailed. Then there were none. The pipeline stretched ahead, the frozen ground covered seamlessly and undisturbed. I stood there as darkness fell, listened to the wind pick up as the storm approached, and made a decision. I was leaving right away. I would pack up the cabin, load everything into the truck, and head straight to the 7th pump station. I would write a report, say I had a medical issue or equipment failure, anything to justify leaving my shift early. Whatever was happening in this section, I didn't want to be a part of it. But when I returned to MSH 47, the cabin door was open. I had locked it when I left that morning. I was absolutely certain of that. You don't forget something like that when you're 40 miles from the nearest person. Sitting in the truck with the engine running, I stared at the open door, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would have been to drive away without looking back. But all my personal belongings, my laptop, spare clothes, and medicine were there. And a part of me, the part that had kept me doing this job for 9 years, despite the isolation and hardship, refused to be driven away by things I couldn't explain. I grabbed the bear spray and slowly approached the cabin, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The door swayed slightly in the wind, and the interior was dark except for the faint glow of the propane heater's pilot light. I paused at the threshold and listened, but heard nothing but the storm beginning overhead. I went inside and pressed the light switch. At first glance, everything seemed fine. My bunk was as I had left it. My belongings were neatly stowed away, and my notes and empty coffee cup from breakfast were still on the small folding table. But something wasn't right. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. The satellite phone was lying with the handset off the cradle. It was where it should have been, on the table. But the handset wasn't in its cradle. It was lying next to the base unit. I clearly remembered putting it back properly the night before. I picked up the handset and listened. Complete silence. Not even the expected dial tone, just absolute emptiness. Then I noticed the smell. Faint but distinct, like diesel fuel and something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and wrong. And following the smell, I went to the corner where I stored my extra supplies and saw that the zipper on my equipment bag was open and partially emptied. Someone had rummaged through my things. With thoughts swirling in my head, I stepped out of the cabin. Someone had been here with me. It wasn't a caribou, nor the wind's tricks. It was a real person who had opened my door, rummaged through my things, and then left without a trace. The question was who and why. I spent the next hour sitting in my truck, doors locked and engine running, watching the cabin as the storm intensified around me. The snow was now falling heavily, the wind pushing it in horizontal sheets, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet. I had to make a decision. Did I risk setting out in this weather and getting stuck or lost, or did I stay at the cabin and hope whoever was there didn't come back? The fuel gauge made the decision for me. I had a quarter of a tank left, which wasn't enough to keep the engine running all night and get me on the road tomorrow. I had to use the cabin. I gathered my courage and went back inside, this time searching every corner and storage space thoroughly. There was nothing. No one was hiding. Apart from a rummaged bag and a phone removed from its holder, there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. I locked the door from the inside, wedged the arm of the chair under the door handle for extra security, and adjusted my bunk so I could clearly see the entrance. The storm raged fiercely all night. The wind slammed against the cabin hard enough to flex and creak the metal walls. Snow piled up outside the cabin, and periodically I could hear it sliding off the roof like an avalanche. I didn't sleep. Bear spray in my lap, I sat on that bunk and watched the door, listening for every creak and rattle. Around 4 in the morning, the hum of the pipeline changed again. Just like before, a slight change in tone indicating a drop in pressure. But this time I heard something else underneath it. A rhythmic, metallic clicking sound, as if someone were hitting the pipe with something hard. The clicks came in groups of 3 at equal intervals, repeating about every 30 seconds. I listened to this rhythm for maybe 10 minutes, trying to convince myself it was some kind of thermal expansion effect, or the storm rattling loose equipment. But the strikes were too regular, too deliberate. Someone or something was out there in the storm, following the pipeline and announcing its presence with these methodical strikes. The knocks were getting closer. I could follow their progress as the sound grew louder, moving along the pipeline from north to south, until it passed right behind the cabin. Then it stopped. There was complete silence except for the wind and my own irregular breathing. I remained frozen on that bunk, too scared to move, minutes turning into hours. The storm began to subside around 6 o'clock. The wind died down and the snow turned into a light snowfall. Gray dawn light seeped through the small window, and with it came such deep fatigue that I could barely keep my eyes open. That's when I heard the satellite phone ring. A sharp, electronic tone came from the handset, still sitting on the desk. But the phone wasn't connected to anything. I had checked the main unit during the call. Both the power source and the external antenna connection had been unplugged. It couldn't possibly be ringing. It rang again. Then once more, each tone was clear and insistent. On the 4th ring, as if I were being watched from outside, I got up and walked toward the desk. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. Static. Only white noise came from the speaker. Just as I was about to put the phone down, I heard something beneath the static. A distant, distorted voice was saying words I couldn't quite make out. Straining to understand, I pressed the phone closer to my ear. The voice became slightly clearer. It was saying numbers, a series of numbers in a flat, emotionless tone. 760, 758, 755. The pressure values were decreasing, spoken at intervals like a countdown. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The sequence of numbers continued uninterrupted. 752, 749, 746. I slammed the phone down and moved away from the desk. The voice stopped immediately, but the pressure values it had reported stuck in my head. I got dressed and went to the outdoor measuring station, quickly making my way through the knee-deep snow left by the storm. The analog pressure gauge read exactly 746 psi. It was the same number the voice on the phone had said. I ran back to the cabin, threw everything I owned into the bags without bothering to organize it, and loaded the truck in record time. I no longer cared about leaving early. I didn't care what the dispatch would say. I cared about nothing but getting out of that area and back to civilization. The road to Pump Station 7, which would normally make me cautious and slow in post-storm conditions, took 3 hours. I pushed the truck harder than it should have been pushed, skidding around corners and plowing through snowdrifts, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for something I knew couldn't be seen following me. When I finally pulled into the station's yard and saw other people, other vehicles, heard people talking about normal things like equipment requests and shift rotations, I nearly collapsed. I wrote an ambiguous report about a medical issue and took emergency leave. I haven't returned to that department since. The company assigned someone else to finish my shift. I heard that person completed all 5 days without reporting anything unusual. The pressure remained at normal levels throughout their shift. There were no strange gauge readings, mysterious handprints, or sounds on disconnected phones. I tried to convince myself that my mind, overworked by stress, isolation, darkness, and cold, was playing tricks on me. But the photos I took are still with me. The caribou on the pipeline, the handprints on the frozen ground. And sometimes, late at night, with my doors locked and lying in bed near my neighbors, I can still hear that voice counting the pressure readings that matched reality with impossible precision. I applied to transfer to the southern section, where I would work with a full team and never be more than a few hours away from town. They approved it without any hassle or questions. But I knew the truth. They didn't. There was something in that isolation, tracking my movements, entering my space, matching my schedule to pressure drops, and sending messages I was never meant to understand. Worst of all, wondering if it was still there, still roaming that area, still hitting the pipeline in groups of 3, counting down numbers on phones that shouldn't be working, and wondering what would happen when those numbers finally reached 0. People think being a security guard on an oil pipeline means sitting in a warm cabin, checking IDs, and watching monitors. Maybe that's true for the southern terminals where there's real traffic. Trucks pass every hour, and shifts are so small you know everyone's name by the end of the first week. Here, on the North Slope, security means something entirely different. Being the only person living in a 100-square-mile area means watching rarely malfunctioning equipment, monitoring threats that almost never come, and talking to yourself during 12-hour shifts to remember what your own voice sounds like. My name is Carter Hayes. I'm 41 years old, a former military police officer, and since leaving the Army in 2009, I've been doing private security work for various oil companies. The Alaska assignment came through a contractor I'd worked with before. It offered good pay for what they called minimal intervention monitoring. In reality, it meant sitting alone in a small security station at mile marker 276, watching camera feeds of an empty pipeline, and occasionally recording vehicles passing on the service road. The station was a reinforced structure, better insulated than maintenance huts, with solid walls, a good heater, a small bathroom, and a communication system connecting me to the company's central dispatch center and other security posts scattered along the 800-mile route. The radio was my only real connection to other people during those shifts. Every 4 hours, I had to contact Station 238 in the south and Station 314 in the north to confirm everything was calm and record any abnormalities. Most nights, the radio checks were the most important part of my shift. Even if we were just exchanging call signs and status codes, hearing another voice through the static was enough for me. At Station 238, a man named Marcus, who had been doing this job longer than me, was on duty. His voice had the flat, worn tone of someone who had learned to conserve his emotional energy for truly important things. Station 314 was run by someone who went by the name Dutch, though I never learned if that was his real name or a nickname. He was new to the job and had an enthusiasm that hadn't yet been worn down by the work, as if he had embarked on some kind of adventure rather than working in a metal box, constantly asking questions about the landscape and wildlife. I started my rotation on a Tuesday in late January. Winter here is a special kind of darkness. The sun appears on the horizon for a few hours each day and then sets again, leaving you in a twilight that grows increasingly dark. The temperature was around minus 35 degrees, cold enough that the moisture in your breath would instantly freeze and fall to the ground as tiny ice crystals, known as diamond dust. I had worked in cold weather before, but this was different. This was a cold you felt personally, as if it were trying to find every gap in your clothing and punish you for daring to live in such a hostile place. The first 2 days were exactly as I expected. I arrived at the station, checked all the equipment, studied the camera feeds showing nothing but empty tundra and the dark pipeline stretching into the distance, and settled into the routine of hourly monitor checks interrupted by 4-hour radio connections. The station had a small electric water heater, and I had brought enough instant coffee to fuel a small army with caffeine. Thanks to the caffeine and the isolation, I slept about 4 hours per shift, which was fine by me. Sleep had never been easy for me anyway. My first radio check was with Marcus at Station 238 at 8 o'clock p.m. on the first day. The standard protocol was just to exchange call signs and confirm status. His voice was clear and professional. Station 238, Marcus here. All quiet? Everything okay there, Carter? Station 276, Hayes, yes. All quiet here too. Thanks for checking in. Copy that. Same channel in 4 hours. The radio went silent, leaving me with the hum of the heaters and the faint electrical buzz of the monitors. I spent the next few hours reading a Western novel I'd brought along. It was about cowboys and cattle rustlers and felt absurdly distant from my current reality. Around midnight, I checked in with Dutch at Station 3114. His voice came in with more static than Marcus's, which made sense given the extra distance and atmospheric conditions. Station 314, this is Dutch. Man, it's dead here tonight. Do you see anything on your screen? Station 276, this is Hayes. No, all quiet. Are you okay? Yeah, just bored. Ever seen what the northern lights do to the cameras? I keep getting these weird flickers in my north-facing images. Could be interference. Check your connections. Make sure nothing's loose from the cold. Okay, see you in 4 hours. The night passed slowly but smoothly. I watched the sunrise. In January, sunrise here meant the sky slowly turning dark blue-gray and then plunging back into darkness a few hours later. The second day passed the same way. Monitor checks, radio connections, instant coffee, and long silences broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the station's metal walls. On the third day, things started to go wrong. The shift started normally, but when I made the scheduled connection with Marcus at 8 o'clock p.m., there was a difference in his voice. He was still professional, still using the proper protocol, but there was a flatness in his tone, beyond his usual emotional detachment. There was a weariness that felt deeper than just sleep deprivation. Station 238, Marcus. Situation normal. Station 26, Hayes. Is everything okay there? There was a longer pause than normal. I could hear static on the connection, and beneath it, a faint sound I couldn't identify. What do you mean, okay? He finally said. And in those 2 words, there was something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Is there anything you want me to relay to headquarters? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Another pause. No, I'm just tired. This shift has been longer than usual. We finished the check and closed the connection, but the conversation stayed with me. Marcus was always steady and calm. This sharpness in his voice felt like finding a crack in a foundation you thought was solid. I noted this interaction in my log, but I didn't know exactly what I was noting. Fatigue? Stress? Loneliness? All of the above? The midnight check with Dutch was even stranger. When I turned on the radio, I heard only static for almost 30 seconds. Then finally his voice came through. Station 314, Dutch here. The communication was terrible, as if someone was turning the signal on and off, his words coming in choppy bursts. Station 276, Hayes. Signal is very poor. Check your equipment. Trying. There's a problem. I keep hearing. The signal deteriorated further and turned completely to static. I tried calling him a few more times, but got no response. Actually, this wasn't unusual. Radio communication here was always unreliable, especially during geomagnetic disturbances. The northern lights Dutch mentioned could completely disrupt radio frequencies. I made another recording and decided to try reaching him again in an hour. An hour later, the radio was working fine. Dutch's voice came through clearly. No static, no interruptions. Station 314, Dutch. Sorry about what happened earlier. There was some strange interference. Everything's fine now. Station 276, Hayes. Glad you got it sorted. You said you heard something earlier. Did I? He sounded genuinely surprised. I don't remember saying that, but the interference was pretty bad. I dropped the subject. It was probably a communication glitch. The interference was so bad I could have misheard him. We confirmed the situation and ended the connection, and I returned to my monitors and my Western novel, trying to ignore the vague unease settling in my chest. On the fourth day, I started hearing sounds. Not from the radio, not during scheduled checks, but in between. At random times while sitting at the monitors, making coffee, or just staring out the window into the darkness. Faint sounds coming from the radio's speaker, even though the device was supposed to be in standby mode and transmit nothing but silence or the occasional carrier wave. The first time was around 3 a.m. I was half asleep in my chair, in that state between sleep and wakefulness, where the brain fills the gaps with fragments of dreams. A sound came from the radio speaker so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Just a few words, broken and distant, as if someone were speaking from the bottom of a well. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the rhythm was definitely human speech, not random, static patterns. I sat up and checked the radio. It was still in standby mode. There was no incoming transmission indicator. I switched it to active mode and turned on the microphone. Station 276, to all stations. Did someone just try to make contact? Silence. Then Marcus's voice, irritable and groggy from being woken up. Station 238, no. Is everything okay there? Station 276, sorry for the early communication. I thought I heard something on the radio. Probably just static. Atmospheric conditions are weird tonight. Go back to sleep, Carter. It was easy for him to say. I stayed awake for the rest of my shift, listening to the radio speaker, but the sounds didn't return. I was almost convinced that I had imagined them, that I had dreamed them, and that I had somehow incorporated the radio into my dream. Almost. The voices returned the next night, this time clearer. When they started, I was wide awake, drinking my 6th or 7th cup of coffee. This time, there were multiple voices, overlapping and talking over each other. I still couldn't make out the words clearly, but they were definitely human. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down the parts I could understand. Pressure drop, north of the marker. I can't see anything. They're not responding. The voices were intermittent, sometimes clear enough to make out individual words, sometimes turning into white noise. I recorded as much as I could, trying to find some pattern or meaning. Were these old broadcasts somehow reflecting back from the atmosphere? Radio signals could bounce in strange ways under certain conditions, especially at these high altitudes where the ionosphere was hit by solar radiation. I waited until the scheduled check-in time and contacted Marcus. Station 238, Marcus here. What's up? Station 276, Hayes. I have a question for you. Are you experiencing unusual radio interference? Are you getting sounds in standby mode? There was a very long pause before his answer. What do you mean by unusual? Random sounds, fragments of conversation, when the radio shouldn't be picking up anything. Another pause. When he spoke again, there was the same weariness in his voice that I had noticed before. Yes. Yes, I hear it too. I thought I was losing my mind. Do you hear it too? Affirmative. It started last night. It's getting clearer each time. Same here. He took a breath audible through the speaker. Listen, Carter. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I've heard some very strange things on these radios. Interference. Satellite interference. Even once a Russian fishing boat in the Bering Sea. But this is different. These voices are talking about our locations, our signals. It's as if they're following the pipeline we're monitoring. My mouth went dry. Are you sure? I specifically heard them talking from Station 238. They were talking about pressure drops, camera malfunctions, and things that haven't happened yet. Or things that haven't happened yet. I don't know anymore. After that, we stayed on the line for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Marcus suggested we document what we heard and compare notes after the rotation was over. We ended the call, and I continued listening to the radio, pen in hand, ready to write down everything that came in. The voices were constant now. They weren't loud, they weren't overpowering, but they were always there in the background while the radio was on standby. 12 different speakers, maybe more, all talking about pipeline operations, security protocols, equipment status. Marcus was right. They were talking about our locations using the signals and station numbers we used. Around 2 o'clock, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, identical to mine, in the same tone and rhythm, was giving a status check report to an unfamiliar station number. Station 276 to Station 402, visual contact confirmed, continuing investigation. There was no such place as Station 402. During my training, I had memorized the locations of the security stations. We had jumped from 314 to 47 north of me. There was no Station 402, and I was definitely not investigating anything, sitting in my chair with my cold coffee, feeling increasingly anxious. I activated my radio and tried to contact Dutch at 3114. There was static. I tried again. Static again. I changed frequencies and tried Marcus. His voice came right through, but something was off. The words were right, the call signs were right, but the tone was different, as if it wasn't Marcus himself speaking, but someone imitating Marcus. Station 238, situation normal. Anything to report? Marcus, is that you? Station 238, Marcus, acknowledge the problem. This is Carter. It's going to sound crazy, but I want you to tell me something only you would know. Something from our first radio check. Silence. Deliberate, calculated silence. Then the voice that could or could not be Marcus spoke again. I cannot comply. Maintain standard protocol. My hands trembling, I turned the radio off completely. That wasn't Marcus. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't him. For the first time since I started the rotation, I sat in the dark station with the radio off, listening to the wind outside and the wild beating of my own heart. Then I noticed the monitors. The camera feeds I'd been watching for 4 days. 16 different views of the pipeline and the tundra were showing something I'd never seen before. Movement. In more than one image, there were dark shapes moving across the snow, heading toward my location. They were very far away, and the resolution was too low to make out details, but they were definitely there, definitely approaching. I switched between images to get a better angle. The shapes continued to advance in an orderly fashion, like a trained team. My military background kicked in, and I started counting. 8, maybe 9 people, spread out in a standard tactical approach formation. They were still several miles away, but at their current speed, they would reach the station in less than an hour. Protocol required me to radio headquarters and request instructions. Protocol also required me to verify the approaching personnel through the proper channels. But I no longer trusted the radio, and I certainly didn't trust anything coming toward me in the tundra. I reviewed my options. The station's small garage, attached to the main building, contained emergency supplies, including a snowmobile. I could escape, trying to reach another station or the Dalton Highway. But escaping meant going out into the dark, minus 35-degree cold, and likely directing whatever was out there directly at other people. The other option was to secure the station and wait. The building was constructed to withstand extreme weather and potential security threats. The door was reinforced steel, the windows were small and high, and I had emergency supplies that would last a week if necessary. I decided to stay. I turned off all the lights and found my way using the dim light from the monitors. The figures on the cameras were approaching. They were now close enough to see more detail. They were human-shaped, wearing heavy winter clothing, but they were moving with an efficiency that was not appropriate for the conditions. No one could move so fluidly in deep snow in such extreme cold. I took out my phone and sent a short message to the company's emergency contact number, briefly explaining the situation. There was no signal. Of course, I knew there was no cell phone service this far north, but desperation makes people do foolish things. They were now less than half a mile away and appeared on the closest camera feed as they entered the pool of light cast by the station's exterior security lights. At that moment, I saw something that made me question all my assumptions. The person in front stopped and looked directly at the camera, and despite the grainy image, I could see enough detail to recognize his face. It was me. Not someone who looked like me, not someone wearing a mask, but me. My face, my body, my distinctive posture that put a little more weight on my left leg due to an old duty injury. The figure waved at the camera, at me, watching from inside. Other figures stood behind him, and when they turned to the cameras, I recognized them too. Marcus, Dutch. Other faces I'd seen in company orientation materials, security personnel at stations I'd never been to. And there, behind the group, another version of me. I stepped away from the monitors, my mind trying to make sense of what I had seen. Some kind of psychological operation. Industrial espionage using deepfakes and coordinated actors. But that didn't explain the voices on the radio. It didn't explain why the figures moved the way they did. It didn't explain the growing certainty inside me that what I was watching was not human at all. They reached the station. I heard footsteps outside. They were moving around, checking the doors and windows with methodical precision. There was no sound, no attempt at communication, just a systematic dismantling of the defenses. I stood in the middle of the room with the only weapon I could find, a fire extinguisher, knowing it wouldn't work but needing something to hold. The radio turned on by itself. I was sure I'd turned it off, but now it was working again, static crackling from the speaker. A voice emerged from the noise, and this time it was definitely mine. Not similar or close, but exactly my voice, the slightly hoarse voice I get when I'm tired. Carter Hayes, Station 276, you need to open the door. Fuck off, I said to the empty room. We won't hurt you. We're here to calm you down. Your shift is over. My shift ends in 3 days. Your shift ended 4 hours ago. You are refusing to accept the assistance team. You need to open the door so we can complete the transfer. I looked at my watch. The date said Thursday. I had started the shift on Tuesday, counting the days carefully. Today should have been Friday, but my watch insisted it was Thursday, and now that I thought about it, I was having trouble remembering everything that had happened over the last few days clearly. The timeline was blurred. Events were overlapping and didn't make sense. Check your records, said a voice that sounded like mine. Check the date stamps. With one hand holding the fire extinguisher ready, I pulled out my logbook with the other. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the entries were wrong. I had logged 6 days on the shift, not 4. 6 days of radio monitoring, monitor checks, coffee breaks, and paperwork. I had logged 6 days even though I had only been here 4. The footsteps outside had stopped. Everything was quiet except for the radio and my irregular breathing. "This is a cognitive disconnection," said the voice, calmly and logically. "A temporary confusion caused by isolation. It sometimes happens to station operators working alone. The company has protocols for this. You just need to open the door and come with us. It's a medical checkup, nothing serious. It happens to the best of us." It sounded reasonable. Everything he said matched what I knew about prolonged isolation. Temporary disorientation, confusion about the sequence of events, even mild hallucinations. I had been trained on these symptoms. And if I really had been here for 6 days instead of 4, if I had lost track of time that badly, then I needed help. I walked to the door, my hand reaching for the lock. The logical part of my brain had already started coming up with explanations. Stress, isolation. The voices on the radio were causing paranoid delusions. Of course, there was a rescue team outside. Of course, my shift was over. I was just confused. I had mixed up the days. When my fingers touched the lock, I saw the images on the monitor again. The figures outside formed a perfect circle around the station, standing completely still, at equal intervals. And in the images showing the area near the door, I could see myself standing there. Not a figure bearing my face, but my own image, visible through the camera, standing inside the station with my hand on the lock. But at the same time, we were watching the monitors in the middle of the room. I looked at my solid, real body, then back at the screen showing me at the door. It was impossible to occupy both positions at the same time. I pulled my hand away from the lock and retreated toward the communications console. The radio crackled, and this time the voice was different. It was Marcus's voice, but somehow wrong, speaking with the same flat emotion. "Carter, it's Marcus. We're all here, all the station operators. We understand. You should too." Understand what? When did the voices start? When did the real voices stop? I thought back over the last few days, trying to pinpoint when things changed. The first strange radio contact with Marcus. Dutch's signal cutting out. The voices in the static. But there was something else. Something I'd normally ignored. The first radio check. The first day at 20 Site. Marcus had asked if I was settled in. A standard question, friendly and appropriate. But Marcus had never met me before, especially no reason to ask about my situation. Our relationship was purely professional, call signs and status codes. "The first check wasn't real," I said aloud. "You weren't the real Marcus." The voice on the radio neither confirmed nor denied it. "We're all out here now, Carter, all operators at all stations. We'll end up here eventually. If you don't open the door while you still can, you'll end up here eventually." "What happens if I don't?" "Then you stay. You stay at that station, monitoring monitors that show nothing, talking on radios to voices that aren't there, recording days that don't pass. You'll become one of the permanent ones." "What's permanent?" "Static." Then a new voice I didn't recognize. Female, young, scared. "My name is Sarah Chen. I was the operator at Station 314 in 2019. I thought I was on a 2-week rotation. 6 months later, they found my body. Frozen in my chair. I never left. I'm still here. Please don't end up like me." More voices joined in. The testimonies of previous operators piling up. Names, dates, stations. They all described the same experience. The voices starting. Confusion in the mind about time. The fake rescue team. And the choice they made. They chose to stay. Station where reality bent and time meant nothing. Or open the door and face whatever was waiting outside. "What's outside?" I asked. "The transfer," my own voice said. "You become what we are. Part of the system. We monitor and we report and we exist in between the static. It's not good, Carter, but it's not the station. The station is worse. I looked around at the metal walls that had been my home for however many days I'd actually been here. The monitors showing empty tundra and impossible figures. The radio that spoke with voices that shouldn't exist. I thought about Sarah Chen, frozen in her chair, still trapped in a shift that should have ended years ago. The figures outside began to move again, closing in on the station. I could see them on every monitor now, pressed against the walls, their faces uniform and wrong. The door started to rattle. Not from them trying to break in, but from something else. The metal was vibrating at a frequency I could feel in my bones. "Last chance," the radio said. "Door or station, choose now." My hand moved toward the lock again, but this time I stopped myself. There was a third option, one they hadn't mentioned because maybe they couldn't. The emergency radio beacon. Every security station had one, a separate system that broadcast directly to company headquarters via satellite. It was only supposed to be used for life-threatening emergencies, but if this didn't qualify, nothing did. I grabbed the beacon from its mount on the wall and activated it. A red light started flashing, and somewhere far above, a signal was being transmitted to receivers that might still be operated by actual humans. The figures outside stopped moving. The radio went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. In that absolute quiet, I heard something new. Helicopter rotors, distant but getting closer. Real rotors, real aircraft, coming from the south where Dead Horse and actual civilization existed. The radio crackled one more time. Wrong choice. Then, nothing. The helicopter arrived 20 minutes later. I watched through the monitors as it landed near the station. Saw actual people get out, people whose movements were natural and random instead of synchronized and perfect. They approached the door and called my name using a loudspeaker. I opened it. Real cold air hit my face. Real human beings in company gear stood there with real concern in their eyes. They said they'd received my emergency beacon and came as fast as they could. They asked if I was hurt, if there had been an equipment failure or a medical emergency. I tried to explain about the voices, about the figures on the monitors, about losing track of time. But when they checked the cameras, there was nothing. Just empty tundra. When they examined my logbook, it showed 4 days of normal entries, nothing unusual. My watch showed the correct date. They flew me out anyway, standard procedure for emergency beacon activation. On the helicopter ride south, I looked down at Station 276 getting smaller below us, and for just a second, I thought I saw figures standing in a circle around it. But when I blinked, they were gone. The company doctor said I experienced an isolated episode of temporal disorientation combined with auditory hallucinations, likely stress-induced. They put me on medical leave and suggested I consider a different assignment when I was ready to return to work. I took the leave but never went back. Sometimes I still hear them, though. Late at night when I'm alone, I'll hear fragments of voices on radio static, cell phone interference, even the white noise from an untuned television. They're still out there, still monitoring, still trying to bring new operators into their system. And sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, if the station really was worse than whatever they'd become. I'll never know for sure, but I do know this. There are voices in the static now, and one of them sounds exactly like me. I never intended to work the Alaska pipeline. My background was wildlife biology, specifically predator behavior patterns in Arctic ecosystems. I'd spent 3 years doing field research on wolf populations in northern Canada, another 2 studying polar bear migration routes, and I was perfectly content to continue that trajectory until the grant money dried up and reality forced me to consider more stable employment. That's how I ended up accepting a contract position as an environmental compliance officer for the pipeline company, monitoring wildlife activity along a remote section of the North Slope to ensure operations weren't disrupting protected species or their habitats. The job description made it sound straightforward enough. I'd be stationed at an observation post near mile marker 198, equipped with cameras, recording equipment, and spotting scopes to document any animal activity within a 2-mile radius of the pipeline. The data I collected would be used for environmental impact reports and regulatory compliance, basically proving the company was following all the rules about minimizing ecological disruption. It was boring work compared to real field research, but it paid significantly better and only required 4-week rotations with 2 weeks off between assignments. My name is Dr. Olivia Wright, though out here nobody bothered with titles or formality. I was just Liv, the wildlife monitor, the person who sat in a small elevated observation post and watched empty tundra through expensive lenses, documenting the occasional caribou herd or fox that wandered through my field of view. The post itself was more sophisticated than I'd expected. A 2-story structure with the ground floor containing living quarters and the upper level serving as the observation platform. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides provided panoramic views of the surrounding landscape, and the equipment setup included thermal imaging cameras, motion-activated trail cameras positioned at various distances from the post, and a powerful spotting scope mounted on a tripod that could resolve details at distances up to 3 miles in good conditions. I arrived at the post in early March, flown in by helicopter from Dead Horse, along with 4 weeks' worth of supplies and a satellite communication system that would be my only link to the outside world. The pilot who dropped me off was friendly in that gruff, seen-everything way that bush pilots develop. He gave me a quick rundown of the emergency protocols, showed me where the backup generator was located, and assured me that someone would check in via satellite phone every 3 days to confirm I was still alive and functional. Then he lifted off, and I was alone with the wind and the snow, and the absolute certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake taking this job. The first week was an adjustment period. I established my daily routine, learning the rhythms of the landscape and familiarizing myself with the equipment. Dawn came late and lasted only a few hours before sliding into the extended twilight that passed for daylight this far north in early spring. I'd wake around 8, make coffee, and spend the dim daylight hours at the observation platform, scanning the tundra and checking the trail camera feeds for any activity that occurred overnight. Most days I saw nothing, just endless white expanse broken occasionally by wind-sculpted snowdrifts and the dark line of the pipeline cutting through the landscape like a surgical scar. The isolation didn't bother me initially. I'd spent plenty of time alone during my research years, often going weeks without seeing another person while tracking animal populations through remote territory. Being alone was comfortable, familiar, a state that allowed me to focus completely on observation without the distraction of human interaction. I kept detailed logs of everything I saw, noting weather conditions, temperature fluctuations, and the rare wildlife sightings that justified my presence. On day 8, I documented my first significant observation. A wolf appeared in my southern field of view around 2 in the afternoon, moving with that purposeful lope wolves use when covering long distances. I got the spotting scope on it quickly and began taking notes. Adult male, dark gray coat, good body condition suggesting recent successful hunting. It was following the pipeline, staying about 30 yards from the structure, moving north. I tracked it for almost 20 minutes until it passed out of visual range. What struck me as unusual was its behavior. Wolves typically don't follow human infrastructure like this. They might cross the pipeline or move near it if their travel route happens to intersect. But this animal was deliberately paralleling it, maintaining that consistent 30-yard distance like it was following an invisible boundary. I made extensive notes and flagged the observation for my next report to the company. The wolf appeared again the following day, same time, same behavior. And the day after that. Each time, it would enter my field of view from the south, follow the pipeline north for the 20 or so minutes it took to cross my observation zone, and then disappear. On the fourth consecutive day, I set up the thermal camera to track it more effectively, and that's when I noticed something that made my scientific training and my gut instinct go to war with each other. The wolf's thermal signature was wrong. Not absent, not invisible, but displaying a heat distribution that didn't match normal wolf physiology. Wolves are warm-blooded mammals with predictable thermal patterns, hotter in the core and extremities, cooler along the back and outer coat. This animal showed uniform temperature across its entire body, like it was made of material that conducted heat evenly, instead of a living creature with organs and circulation. I reviewed the thermal footage multiple times, checking the camera's calibration and running diagnostics to rule out equipment malfunction. Everything checked out. The camera was functioning perfectly, accurately displaying the thermal signatures of other objects in the frame. The pipeline's heat, snow surface temperatures, even my own body when I stepped into view to test it. But the wolf remained thermally uniform, impossible, wrong. I should have reported it immediately. Should have flagged the anomaly and requested technical support to either explain or verify what I was seeing. Instead, I kept watching. Scientific curiosity, I told myself. I needed more data before making claims that would sound absurd in an official report. You don't tell your employer that you're observing a thermodynamically impossible wolf without absolutely bulletproof evidence. The wolf's appearances became the focal point of my days. I'd positioned myself at the observation platform well before 2 p.m., cameras ready, scope focused, waiting for that dark shape to appear on the southern horizon. It never failed to show. Every single day, same time, same route, same impossible thermal signature. I started noticing other details that didn't add up. Its gait never varied, not even slightly. The distance between each paw placement was mechanically consistent, like watching a looped animation rather than a living animal adapting to terrain. And it never looked around, never scanned for prey or threats, never displayed any of the constant environmental awareness that characterizes wild canids. On day 14, I decided to see what would happen if I tried to approach it. I bundled into my extreme cold weather gear, grabbed my handheld radio and emergency beacon, and headed out when the wolf was approximately half a mile north of my position. My plan was to intercept it, maybe get close enough to observe its behavior at shorter range, possibly even collect photographic evidence that would help explain the thermal anomaly. The cold hit hard the moment I left the observation post. March on the North Slope is marginally warmer than deep winter, but marginally still means temperatures around -20 with wind chill pushing it much lower. I moved as quickly as the snow and cold allowed, angling to intersect the wolf's projected path, my breath forming ice crystals that hung in the air behind me. I reached the interception point and waited, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. The wolf should have been visible by now, should have been close enough to spot even without binoculars. But there was nothing. I waited 15 minutes, then 30, my extremities starting to go numb despite the heavy gear. The wolf never appeared. When I made it back to the observation post, my fingers barely functional from the cold, I checked the trail camera footage. The wolf had passed through my observation zone exactly on schedule, following its usual route. Somehow, it had moved through the area while I was standing there waiting for it, and I'd seen nothing. No animal, no tracks, no disturbance in the snow, like it existed only through the cameras, invisible to direct observation. That realization should have terrified me, should have sent me to the satellite phone to request an emergency extraction, or, at minimum, to report equipment failure or personal psychological distress. Instead, it excited me. I was observing something that broke the established rules, something that challenged my understanding of what was possible. The scientist in me wanted to document it, to understand the mechanism, to add this impossible data to my notes, and eventually figure out an explanation. I became obsessive. My logs, which had been professionally detailed accounts of weather and wildlife, devolved into pages of notes about the wolf. Measurements of its size, estimates of its speed, frame-by-frame analysis of its movement patterns. I stopped bothering with other observations, stopped documenting the occasional fox or ptarmigan. The wolf was all that mattered. Day 19 brought a new development. The wolf stopped at the midpoint of my observation zone instead of continuing its usual steady progress. It stopped and sat, about 40 yards from the pipeline, facing directly toward my observation post. I zoomed the scope in as far as it would go and felt my breath catch. The wolf was staring at me, not at the building generally, but at me specifically, making direct eye contact through the scope's lens despite the distance and the glass and the physical impossibility of it knowing exactly where I was positioned. We maintained that eye contact for almost an hour. I didn't move, didn't look away, didn't even consider the absurdity of having a staring contest with an animal that might not be real. Its eyes were yellow in the scope's view, bright and clear, and there was intelligence in them that went beyond normal animal awareness. It was studying me the same way I'd been studying it, observing and cataloging and drawing conclusions I couldn't guess. Then it stood, turned, and continued north, disappearing from view exactly as it had every previous day. I sat at the observation platform until long after dark, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations that all fell short of accounting for what I'd witnessed. The next day, the wolf brought friends. Not friends exactly, that's too human a term, but other wolves, 7 of them moving in a loose formation, all displaying that same mechanical gait and uniform thermal signature. They followed the pipeline route together, and when they reached the midpoint, they all stopped and sat, 7 pairs of yellow eyes staring at my observation post, at me, with that same focused intelligence. I photographed them, documented them, filled pages with observations and sketches. They sat for 2 hours before standing in unison and continuing their journey north. I was so focused on them, so absorbed in trying to capture every detail, that I didn't immediately notice the change in my other camera feeds. The trail cameras, positioned at intervals around my observation area, had been mostly inactive for weeks. The occasional triggered recording of a fox or a bird, but nothing significant. Now, reviewing the overnight footage, I found they'd all activated within the same 10-minute window around 3 a.m., and they'd all recorded the same thing. Wolves. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, impossible to count accurately in the dark and the overlapping motion. They'd moved through my observation area in complete silence, triggering every camera, passing within yards of the observation post. All of them moving north, following the pipeline, their eyes reflecting the camera's infrared illuminators as bright white points in the darkness. I replayed the footage obsessively, trying to count individuals, trying to find any variation in their appearance or behavior. They were identical. Not similar, not characteristic of the same species, but actually identical down to the smallest detail. Same size, same markings, same gait. Like copies of a single animal multiplied into an army. That's when I started to understand that I wasn't observing wildlife anymore. I was being shown something, presented with evidence of something that existed outside normal biological frameworks. The question was why? Why reveal themselves to me specifically? Why follow the pipeline? Why the escalating displays of numbers and coordination? Day 23, I woke to find tracks in the snow surrounding the observation post. Wolf tracks, hundreds of them, circling the building in concentric rings that grew tighter toward the structure. They'd been there while I slept, moving silently over the snow, coming close enough to touch the walls. The tracks showed no sign of any individual wolf stopping or investigating, just that constant circular movement, around and around, tightening the spiral until the innermost ring was pressed right against the foundation. I stood at the window, looking down at those tracks, and realized I was shaking. Not from cold, but from the understanding that something was claiming this space, marking territory in a way that had nothing to do with normal animal behavior. The tracks were a message, a statement of presence and intent that I was supposed to interpret. The satellite phone call that day was from Mitchell, the company liaison who handled check-ins with remote personnel. His voice was cheerful and casual, asking about weather conditions and whether I needed any supplies during the next helicopter run. I almost told him about the wolves, almost explained that something impossible was happening and I needed extraction immediately. But when I opened my mouth to speak, different words came out. Everything's fine here. Wildlife activity is minimal. No concerns to report. I heard myself say it, heard the calm, professional tone, and some part of me was screaming that those weren't the words I'd intended to speak. Mitchell accepted the report, reminded me the next check-in was in 3 days, and disconnected. I sat holding the phone, staring at it like it was a foreign object, trying to understand why I'd lied. That night, the wolves came to the windows. I woke to the sound of breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from multiple directions. When I looked out from the observation platform, they were there, standing on their hind legs with their front paws pressed against the glass, dozens of them surrounding the building. Their eyes reflected the interior lights, creating a constellation of yellow points in the darkness. They didn't try to break in, didn't scratch or paw at the windows, just stood there maintaining that bipedal posture that was wrong for their anatomy, breathing in synchronization, watching me watch them. I counted 23 visible wolves before I stopped counting, before the numbers became meaningless in the face of their impossible presence. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Could have been minutes or hours. Time felt slippery and unreliable. Eventually, I realized I was standing at the window with my hand pressed against the glass, mirroring their posture, and I couldn't remember moving into that position. My palm was against the cold glass, and on the other side, separated by a 1/4 inch of material, a wolf's paw was pressed in exactly the same spot. The contact felt significant, like completing a circuit or establishing a connection. Information flooded into my mind, not words exactly, but understanding. The wolves weren't animals, had never been animals, were something that used the wolf form because it was convenient, recognizable, less unsettling than their actual nature. They were observers like me, but on a scale and timeline that made my 4-week rotation look like a single heartbeat. They'd been watching the pipeline for years, decades maybe, documenting the intrusion into their territory the same way I documented animal activity. And now they were offering me a choice: continue as I was, finish my rotation and leave and file reports that would be ignored or explained away, go back to my normal life with memories that would fade into uncertainty. Or stay, become part of their observation, expand my perception beyond human limitations, understand the landscape at a level that my scientific training had only hinted was possible. The wolf on the other side of the glass tilted its head, waiting for my response. I could feel the weight of the decision, could sense that choosing either option would fundamentally change who and what I was. Stay human and leave, or become something else and truly see. My hand was still on the glass. I could feel warmth radiating through it despite the cold, could feel something flowing between us, between them, between the observation post and the tundra and the pipeline, and everything that existed in this strange confluence of human industry and ancient landscape. I pulled my hand back, stepped away from the window. The decision was made, though I couldn't articulate exactly what I'd chosen. The wolves lowered themselves back to all fours in perfect unison and dispersed into the darkness, leaving only tracks in the snow that would be gone by morning when the wind inevitably erased them. The rest of my rotation passed quietly. The wolves stopped appearing during the day, stopped triggering the trail cameras, stopped leaving evidence of their presence. I filed my final reports, documenting minimal wildlife activity and recommending continued monitoring. Mitchell sounded pleased when I gave him my end-of-rotation summary, said I'd done good work, and asked if I wanted to sign on for another 4-week assignment. I declined, told him I'd decided to return to academic research, pursue some new directions in my field. He accepted this without question, wished me luck, and confirmed the extraction helicopter for the following morning. That last night, I stood at the observation platform and watched the tundra under the aurora. Green light rippled across the sky, illuminating the snow in shifting patterns. And in that shifting light, I saw them. Not wolves anymore, but something else, something that didn't have a name in human language. They were there in the landscape, had always been there, would always be there. Observers and guardians and aspects of the place itself. I'd chosen to remain human, to go back to my life and my research and my limited perception. But I knew now that I'd always be aware of them, would always sense that other level of observation happening around me, would always wonder what I might have become if I'd made the other choice. The helicopter came at dawn. I loaded my equipment, my notes, my carefully documented lies about minimal wildlife activity. As we lifted off, I looked down at the observation post growing smaller below, and for just a moment, I saw a dark shape sitting in the snow beside it. One wolf, alone, watching the helicopter depart. I never took another contract with the pipeline company. I tried to go back to academic research, but the work felt hollow now, superficial. I was studying animal behavior while knowing that some animals weren't animals at all. That observation itself could be a bi-directional process, that the watchers could be watched. I kept the thermal footage of that first wolf, the one with the impossible heat signature. It's stored on a hard drive in my office, along with hundreds of other observations I'll never publish, never share, never explain. Sometimes I review it late at night, watching that mechanically perfect gait, those yellow eyes that knew I was watching long before I knew it was aware. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of dark shapes that vanish when I look directly at them. They're still observing, still documenting, still offering that same choice they offered at the observation post. But I made my decision, and I have to live with it. I just hope they continue to let me live with it. The worst part isn't what I saw or what I learned. The worst part is knowing I was given a choice between remaining human or becoming something more, something that could truly understand the landscape and my place in it. And I chose limitation. I chose ignorance. I chose to stay in the comfortable prison of human perception instead of expanding into something I can't even properly imagine. Every day, I wonder if I made the right choice. And every night, through my bedroom window, I sometimes see yellow eyes watching from the darkness, patient and eternal, still waiting to see if I'll change my mind. I've been running ice roads for 17 years, hauling everything from drilling equipment to groceries up the Dalton Highway to the oil fields on Alaska's North Slope. It's dangerous work, the kind that pays well because most people aren't crazy enough to drive 70-ton trucks across frozen rivers in sub-zero temperatures with nothing but faith in the ice thickness reports keeping them from a watery grave. But I'm good at it, always have been. Never missed a delivery. Never put a truck through the ice, never failed to make my schedule no matter what weather came at me. My name is Wade Briggs, and up until February of last year, I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at a person. The company I contract with handles logistics for several of the major pipeline operations, moving supplies between pump stations and remote work camps along the 800-mile route. Most runs are solo, just you and your truck and the endless white highway stretching north. But occasionally, they'll organize convoys for high-priority deliveries or when weather conditions are bad enough that traveling in groups provides extra safety. 3 or 4 trucks moving together, maintaining radio contact, able to assist if someone breaks down or slides off the road. This particular run was a convoy job. 6 trucks total, leaving Fairbanks on a Tuesday morning with supplies bound for Pump Station 5 and several smaller facilities beyond it. I was driving Truck 3 in the formation, hauling mechanical parts and replacement valving that the station needed for scheduled maintenance. The other drivers were guys I'd worked with before, professionals who knew the road and respected the dangers. Travis was running lead in Truck 1, experienced enough that the company used him to train new drivers. Mick and Coleman had Trucks 2 and 4, both solid operators. Trucks 5 and 6 were driven by a pair of younger guys, Jesse and someone whose name I never caught, running their first winter season but showing good judgment so far. We departed Fairbanks in decent conditions, temperature around 0, light wind, visibility good enough to see a mile or more down the highway. The Dalton is mostly gravel and ice this time of year, winding north through terrain that transitions from boreal forest to tundra as you gain elevation and latitude. We maintained a steady 50 miles per hour, where conditions allowed, spacing ourselves about a quarter-mile apart, close enough to provide mutual support but far enough to avoid creating hazards if someone had to brake suddenly. The radio chatter was typical for these runs, Travis calling out road conditions and obstacles ahead, the rest of us confirming we copied the information and reporting our own observations. We passed through the small checkpoint at the Yukon River around noon, got confirmation that the ice bridge was solid and the temperature forecast looked stable for the next 24 hours. Everything was nominal, routine, boring in the way that professional haulers prefer. Boring means nothing is trying to kill you. We made Coldfoot around 3 p.m. and took a brief stop to refuel and check our loads. Coldfoot is the last real outpost before you hit the true wilderness, the last place to get fuel or food or help if something goes wrong with your vehicle. After Coldfoot, you're committed to the run, trusting your equipment and your skills to get you through the next 200 miles of absolute isolation. The sun was already setting as we pulled out, that brief winter daylight fading into the extended twilight that precedes full darkness. I'd driven this section hundreds of times, knew every turn and grade, could navigate it in complete darkness if necessary. The highway climbed steadily toward Adigan Pass, the highest point on the Dalton, where the road crosses the Brooks Range through a gap that's infamous for sudden weather changes and whiteout conditions. We were about 40 miles north of Coldfoot when Travis radioed that he was seeing something unusual ahead. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the undercurrent of confusion. Convoy lead to all trucks. I've got what looks like a vehicle off the road, south side, approximately 2 miles ahead. Looks like a truck, can't tell the condition from this distance. We all acknowledged and maintained speed while Travis approached the location. Through my windshield I could see his taillights in the growing darkness, the red glow steady and bright. Then I saw him brake, his truck slowing as he pulled onto the shoulder near the disabled vehicle. "All trucks, hold position. I'm going to check this out." Travis's voice came through clear on the radio. "Looks like a Kenworth older model, off the road but not rolled. No lights, no sign of the driver." I brought my truck to a stop behind Mick's rig, putting on my hazards and watching as Travis climbed out of his cab and walked toward the abandoned truck. Even from a quarter-mile back, I could see his flashlight beam playing across the vehicle, illuminating what looked like an intact truck that had simply rolled to a stop on the shoulder for no apparent reason. Travis spent maybe 5 minutes examining the scene before getting back on the radio. No driver, no cargo visible, fuel tank is half full, and the keys are still in the ignition. Engine's cold, been here a while. No obvious damage or mechanical failure. This is weird, folks. Truck looks like someone just parked it here and walked away. We discussed options over the radio. Standard protocol would be to call it in to the state troopers and continue our run. Let the authorities handle the abandoned vehicle investigation. But something about the situation felt off to all of us. You don't abandon a truck in the middle of nowhere without a compelling reason, and you definitely don't leave the keys in it. Any ID visible? Paperwork? Company logos? Mick asked over the radio. Negative. The truck's been stripped of all identifying marks. No company name, no DOT numbers, nothing. Just bare metal and primer. Travis paused, and I could hear wind noise through his open truck door. I'm going to try the radio in this thing, see if it still works. What happened next lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it's burned into my memory with the clarity of a high-speed camera recording. Through my windshield, I watched Travis reach into the abandoned truck's cab, presumably to check the radio. Then every single light on his truck went out simultaneously. Not just the running lights and headlights, but the interior cab lights. The dashboard illumination, everything. His truck went completely dark, like someone had cut all power to it in an instant. The radio hissed with static for a moment. Then Travis's voice came through, tight with controlled panic. Power just cut out completely. All systems down. I'm getting back in my cab. Everyone stay in your vehicles. I watched him run back to his truck, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He climbed in, and I could see him through the windshield trying switches and controls. A minute passed, then 2. The radio stayed silent except for the faint background hiss of the open channel. Travis, what's your status? I finally called, unable to stand the silence anymore. No response. I could see his silhouette in the cab moving around, apparently still trying to get his truck restarted. But something about the way he was moving seemed off, too jerky and mechanical, like watching someone operate marionette controls rather than normal human motion. Mick's voice came through next, strain evident in his tone. Wade, Coleman, you seeing this? Something's wrong with Travis. We all were seeing it. The figure in Travis's cab was still moving, still going through the motions of checking switches and trying to start the engine. But the movements were wrong on a fundamental level. Too repetitive, too precise, like a loop playing over and over. I'm going up there, Coleman announced, and I could hear his door opening over the radio. Negative, stay in your vehicle, I said quickly, some instinct screaming that approaching Travis's truck was exactly the wrong move. Coleman, hold position. Something's not right here. But Coleman was already out, and through my mirrors I could see his flashlight beam as he walked past my truck toward Travis. The younger guys in trucks 5 and 6 were on the radio now, their voices edged with fear, asking what was happening and whether we should turn around. Coleman reached Travis's truck and stood there for a moment, shining his light through the driver's side window. The radio picked up his breathing, heavy and fast, and then he spoke in a voice that had gone very quiet. That's not Travis. What do you mean? Mick demanded. I mean, that's not Travis sitting in there. It looks like him, same build, same coat, but something's wrong with the face. It's not right. The figure in the truck stopped moving, just froze mid-motion, hands on the steering wheel, head turned toward the windshield. Then, very slowly, it rotated its head toward Coleman, and even from my position 200 yards back, I could see Coleman take an involuntary step away from the truck. "Get back here right now," I said into the radio, my voice harder than I intended. "Coleman, I need you to walk back to your truck. Don't run, just walk steadily and get back in your cab." Coleman backed away from Travis's truck, his flashlight still pointed at the driver's window, and I could hear his breathing getting more ragged. "It's watching me. Jesus Christ, it's watching me move." "Keep coming back. You're doing fine," I said, tracking his progress in my mirror. "Nice and steady. Don't look away from it, but keep moving." He made it back to his truck and climbed in, slamming the door hard enough that I could hear it over the radio. "That wasn't Travis," he repeated, his voice shaking now. "I don't know what that was, but it wasn't human." We sat there in our trucks, 6 vehicles stretched along the Dalton Highway in the gathering darkness, trying to process what had just happened. Travis was gone, replaced by something that wore his appearance but moved wrong and watched with attention that didn't feel human. And somewhere ahead of us was an abandoned truck that had somehow triggered this whole situation. Mick was the first to vocalize what we were all thinking. "We need to turn around, right now. Get back to Coldfoot and figure this out from there." I agreed immediately. Whatever was happening here was beyond our ability to handle. We needed to retreat, get somewhere with other people and communication infrastructure, and let someone else deal with the impossibility we'd just witnessed. But when I tried to start my backing procedure to turn around on the narrow highway, my truck wouldn't respond. The engine was running fine, all my systems showed green, but when I put it in reverse, nothing happened. The transmission wouldn't engage. I tried forward. Nothing. Neutral. Nothing. My truck was running but completely immobile. The radio lit up with similar reports from the other drivers. Jesse's truck wouldn't shift gears. The other young guy's transmission was frozen. Coleman's steering had locked up. Mick's brakes wouldn't release. Each of us had a different mechanical failure, but the result was the same. We were stuck, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in a convoy formation on a deserted highway with something wearing Travis's face, us sitting in the lead truck. "This isn't mechanical failure," Mick said, stating the obvious. "This is something else." Through my windshield, I could see movement at Travis's truck again. The figure climbed out, moving with that same wrong mechanical precision, and stood beside the truck facing our convoy. Even at this distance in the dim light, I could see that Coleman had been right. It looked like Travis, matched his height and build, wore his distinctive red parka and wool cap, but the proportions were subtly off. The arms hung a little too long, the head sat at a slightly wrong angle, the stance was too rigid. It started walking toward us. Not running, not rushing, just a steady measured walk that somehow felt more threatening than any aggressive charge. It walked past the abandoned Kenworth, past the section of highway where Travis had first stopped, directly toward the rest of our immobilized convoy. "Lock your doors, stay in your cabs, do not engage with it," I said into the radio, my training and experience kicking in despite the surreal horror of the situation. "Windows up, doors locked, lights on. We stay inside our vehicles no matter what." The thing reached Mick's truck, which was positioned directly ahead of mine. It stopped beside the driver's door and just stood there, looking up at Mick through the window. I could see Mick's silhouette in his cab, see him shrinking back from the door, and hear his breathing over the radio getting faster and more panicked. "It's looking at me," Mick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right at me, and it's smiling." I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the figure standing beside Mick's truck. What I saw made my stomach drop. The face was Travis's, or a version of it, but stretched and reformed into an expression that human muscles couldn't achieve. The smile was too wide, extending past where lips should end, and the eyes were wrong, too reflective, catching the light like animal eyes instead of normal human eyes. It stood there for maybe 2 minutes, maintaining that horrible smile, then moved on. It walked past Mick's truck, past mine without stopping, continuing down the line toward Coleman and the younger drivers. "What does it want?" Jesse's voice came through the radio, high-pitched with fear. "What the fuck is it doing?" I didn't have an answer. The thing walked the entire length of our convoy, pausing briefly at each truck to look at the driver, maintaining that same impossible smile. When it reached the last truck, the one driven by the guy whose name I never learned, it stopped and stood there longer than it had at any other vehicle. Then it spoke, and its voice came through every radio in the convoy simultaneously, speaking over our open channel despite not having any visible radio equipment. The voice was Travis's, but layered somehow, like multiple recordings of him speaking the same words played at slightly offset intervals. "The convoy cannot stop. The convoy must continue north. The road only goes forward now." "Fuck that," Coleman said immediately. "We're not going anywhere with that thing." But even as he spoke, I felt my truck shudder and lurch forward. My transmission had engaged on its own, overriding my controls, putting the vehicle in motion without any input from me. I grabbed the wheel and tried to steer, tried to hit the brakes, but nothing responded. My truck was driving itself, maintaining position in the convoy formation following Mick's truck, which was also moving independently of its driver's control. All 6 trucks were rolling forward now, our speeds synchronizing automatically, spacing ourselves at exactly even intervals. We passed Travis's abandoned truck, past the thing wearing his form, which stood watching us go by with that stretched smile. In my rearview mirror, I saw it raise one hand in a wave as we left it behind. "Shut down your engines," I shouted into the radio. "Kill the ignition. Cut all power." I twisted my key to the off position, but the engine kept running, kept pulling my truck north along the Dalton Highway. The dashboard showed the ignition was off, but the engine note didn't change, didn't even hiccup. We were being driven by something that didn't need our cooperation or our engine's mechanical function. For the next 3 hours, we rolled north through complete darkness, our convoy maintaining perfect formation while none of us had any control over our vehicles. We tried everything. Mick disconnected his battery terminals, which should have killed all electrical systems. His truck kept rolling. Coleman physically broke his ignition switch with a hammer. No effect. Jesse opened his door and tried to jump out, planning to tuck and roll, but the door slammed shut on its own with enough force to nearly catch his arm. We were passengers in our own trucks, being delivered somewhere by something that had taken control of our convoy. The only thing that still worked normally was the radio, which seemed almost deliberately maintained to let us communicate, to let us share our growing terror as we were pulled deeper into the wilderness. Around hour 4, the landscape began to change in ways that didn't match what I knew of this route. The Dalton Highway follows a specific path, crosses certain landmarks, passes through terrain I'd memorized over years of running it. But now we were moving through areas I didn't recognize. The mountains were wrong, positioned at angles that didn't match the Brooks Range. The tree line ended and started in places where it shouldn't. Even the stars overhead seemed positioned incorrectly. Familiar constellations shifted and distorted. "We're not on the Dalton anymore," Mick said quietly over the radio, voicing what we all realized. "I don't know where we are." The convoy rolled on. At some point, I noticed we'd picked up additional trucks. Between Mick's rig and mine, there were now 2 vehicles I didn't recognize, older models that hadn't been part of our original convoy. Behind me, more unfamiliar trucks had appeared, extending the convoy to 8 vehicles, then 10, then 12. "Anyone else seeing the extra trucks?" Coleman asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. We all confirmed. New trucks were appearing in our formation, inserting themselves seamlessly into the convoy as if they'd always been there. Through the darkness and the poor visibility, I couldn't make out details about them. Just shapes and running lights, trucks that might have been real or might have been something else wearing the appearance of trucks. One of the new vehicles pulled alongside mine, matching my speed exactly, close enough that I could look across at the driver's cab. A figure sat behind the wheel, hands positioned at 10 and 2, staring straight ahead. The face was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. It was me, not someone who looked like me, but actually me, down to the scar on my chin from a bar fight in Deadhorse 3 years ago, and the specific way I wore my cap tilted slightly to the left. The driver turned its head and looked at me, making direct eye contact, and smiled that same stretched, impossible smile the Travis thing had worn. Then it mouthed words I could read through the window. "You're already gone." The truck accelerated and moved ahead, disappearing into the darkness at the front of the convoy. I sat there, shaking, my mind trying to reject what I'd just seen while knowing that rejection was pointless. Something had taken us, was using us for a purpose I couldn't comprehend, and had the ability to duplicate us, to create copies that could drive trucks and wear our faces and smile with mouths that stretched too wide. Jessie was crying on the radio, long, ragged sobs interspersed with prayers and pleas for this to stop. The other young driver had gone silent an hour ago, either too terrified to speak or passed out from shock. Mick and Coleman were talking quietly to each other on a side channel, their voices occasionally breaking through with fragments of conversation about their families and things they wished they'd done differently. I focused on staying alert, maintaining awareness of my surroundings even though I had no control over my movement. Professional habits die hard, and some part of me insisted that observation and documentation might matter, even if I couldn't see how. We'd been driving for almost 6 hours when lights appeared ahead. Not the scattered lights of a town or facility, but a massive concentration of illumination that didn't match anything I knew existed on the north slope. As we got closer, the lights resolved into what looked like an enormous truck stop, brightly lit, with hundreds of vehicles parked in organized rows. Our convoy slowed and began filing into the facility, following painted lines on the ground that directed us to specific parking positions. My truck rolled into an assigned space between 2 other rigs, and finally, mercifully, stopped moving. The engine shut off. My controls became responsive again, showing all green on the dashboard. The radio crackled with Coleman's voice, cautious and uncertain. "Did we just arrive somewhere? Anyone know where this is?" None of us had answers. Through my windshield, I could see the facility spread out in all directions, row after row of parked trucks extending beyond my line of sight. Buildings that looked like service centers and fuel stations sat at regular intervals, all brightly lit but showing no signs of activity or personnel. "I see people," Jesse said suddenly, his voice rising with hope. "Outside, walking between the trucks. We're not alone." I looked and saw what he meant. Figures were moving through the rows of vehicles, walking with purpose like truck drivers checking their loads or heading to a break room. But something about their movement made me hesitate before opening my door. They all walked at the same pace, maintained the same posture, moved with that same mechanical precision I'd seen in the Travis thing. "Don't get out," I said quickly. "Those aren't people." But Jesse had already opened his door. I watched in my mirror as he climbed down from his cab, relief evident in his body language. He started walking toward the nearest figure, calling out a greeting that I could hear faintly through his open door before he'd moved out of radio range. The figure he approached stopped and turned toward him. Even from a distance I could see it smile. Then it grabbed Jesse, the movement impossibly fast, and pulled him close like an embrace. Jesse's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. When the figure stepped back, there were 2 Jessies standing there, The original had stopped moving, standing rigid and still, while the duplicate began walking away with that same mechanical gait all the others used. Within seconds, the original Jessie collapsed, folding in on itself like a deflating balloon until there was nothing left but empty clothes lying on the pavement. "Oh God," Mick breathed over the radio. "Oh Jesus Christ, did everyone see that?" We'd all seen it, watched it happen. Understood now what this place was and what happened to the trucks and drivers who ended up here. This was where the copies were made, where something took the form and memory and appearance of drivers and sent them back out into the world while the originals were discarded like used packaging. "We need to leave," Coleman said, his voice steady despite the horror we'd witnessed. "Right now. Start your engines, we're forcing our way out of here." I turned my key and my engine roared to life, responsive and normal. The other trucks did the same. Our convoy reforming, but this time under our own control. We started backing out of the parking spaces, preparing to make a run for whatever exit we could find. That's when all the other trucks started too. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all firing up simultaneously in perfect synchronization. They began rolling forward, moving to block our exit routes, forming a wall of metal and machinery that cut off any escape path. The radio came alive with that layered voice, speaking through every channel simultaneously. "The convoy cannot leave. The convoy has arrived. You will join the road." The other trucks closed in, boxing us into our parking spaces, their engines idling with patient mechanical rhythm. Through my windows, I could see more figures approaching, dozens of them wearing faces I half recognized from years of running these roads. Drivers I'd known who'd disappeared on runs and been presumed lost to accidents or weather. They were all here, or rather, the templates they'd been copied from were here, waiting to be processed and duplicated. We tried everything to escape, ramming through the barriers, coordinating our movements to create gaps, even attempting to climb out and run on foot. Nothing worked. The facility had us, and it became clear that it could keep us as long as it wanted. Could wear us down through exhaustion and fear until we made mistakes like Jessie had. I don't know how long we stayed trapped in that parking space. Hours, certainly, maybe days. Time felt wrong there, elastic and unreliable. We took turns sleeping, maintaining radio watch, trying to find any weakness in the containment. But the facility was patient, the other trucks were tireless, and the figures that walked among the vehicles never stopped moving, never showed any sign of boredom or fatigue. It was Mick who finally made the decision that saved us, or at least gave us a chance. He'd been quietly observing patterns, tracking the movement of the figures and the cycling of the trucks, looking for any regularity that might indicate a vulnerability. "There's a shift change," he announced over the radio. "Every 6 hours, all the figures return to those buildings at the edge of the facility, and for approximately 3 minutes, the parking area is completely empty. Our next window is in 18 minutes. We have prepared in silence, each of us understanding this was likely our only chance. When Mick called the countdown, we timed it perfectly. At his mark, we fired up our engines and punched through the line of unmanned trucks surrounding us, our rigs taking damage but breaking free. The facility came alive behind us, hundreds of trucks starting to pursue, but we had momentum and desperation on our side. We found what looked like an exit road and took it, pushing our damaged vehicles as hard as they'd go, expecting at any moment to lose control or break down completely. The pursuit lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. One by one, the following trucks fell back or disappeared, until we were alone on a dark highway that gradually became familiar again. The stars realigned themselves into proper constellations. The landscape reformed into terrain I recognized. We were back on the Dalton Highway about 30 miles south of where we'd originally encountered the abandoned truck. Our convoy had been reduced to 5 vehicles. Travis was gone. Jesse was gone. And we were running on damaged trucks with no clear understanding of what had just happened or whether we'd truly escaped. We made it to Pump Station 5 and delivered our loads, filing reports about mechanical failures and weather delays. Nobody asked too many questions. Loads were late sometimes, that's just how it was up here. The company docked our pay for the damaged trucks and assigned us new routes. I never saw Mick or Coleman or the other surviving driver again. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't compare notes or try to make sense of it. There was an unspoken agreement that acknowledging it might somehow make it real in a way we couldn't handle. I kept running ice roads for another 6 months before I couldn't do it anymore. Every convoy I saw, I wondered if the other trucks were real. Every driver I passed, I looked for signs of that mechanical movement or impossible smile. And sometimes, late at night on empty stretches of highway, I'd see trucks in my mirrors that matched my speed exactly, maintaining that perfect following distance. And I'd wonder if they'd finally sent the copies back to finish what they'd started. I don't run ice roads anymore. I took a job in Fairbanks, dispatching for a local freight company, keeping my feet on solid ground and my trucks where I can see them. But I still hear things on the radio sometimes, late at night when the channels should be quiet. Voices calling out positions and status reports using call signs that don't exist, describing routes through places that aren't on any map. The convoy is still running out there. I know it is. Still collecting drivers, still making copies, still serving whatever purpose that facility was built to serve. And some part of me knows that the Wade Briggs who came back from that run isn't entirely the same Wade Briggs who left Fairbanks that Tuesday morning. Sometimes I catch my reflection moving slightly wrong in mirrors and windows. Just a small deviation from what I intended. A gesture that doesn't quite match my muscle memory. And I wonder if I really escaped, or if I'm just another copy, programmed well enough to believe I'm real, waiting for the signal to return to the convoy and take my place among the others. My name is Nathan Cross, and I've been flying helicopters over the Alaska pipeline for 6 years. Aerial inspections, crew transport, emergency response, whatever the company needs. It's good work, pays well, and the views are something most people never get to see. March 12th started like any other inspection run. I lifted off from Deadhorse at 0600, clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions for the 70-mile southbound road I'd flown 100 times before. My job was simple. Follow the pipeline, look for visual anomalies, photograph anything unusual, radio in my findings. 2 hours up, 2 hours back, routine as breathing. The first hour went smooth. I followed the dark line of the pipeline across white tundra, my altitude holding steady at 500 feet. The pipeline stretched ahead and behind, perfectly straight, absolutely predictable. Nothing moved down there except occasional snow devils kicked up by wind. At mile marker 247, fog rolled in. Not gradually, just suddenly there, thick and gray, rising from the ground like something exhaled by the earth itself. Within seconds, visibility dropped to near zero. I climbed to 800 feet, trying to get above it, but the fog climbed with me. 1,000 feet, 1,500. The fog stayed level with my aircraft, maintaining a consistent distance below my skids like it was tethered to me. I radioed Deadhorse, static. Tried the emergency frequency, more static. My instruments showed everything normal, fuel good, engine temperature nominal, navigation systems functioning. But I'd lost all radio contact. That's when I saw the other helicopter. It appeared off my port side, maybe 200 yards out, flying the exact same heading at the exact same altitude. Same model as mine, same company markings, even the same registration number on the tail. I was looking at my own aircraft flying parallel to me. I altered course 10 degrees starboard. The other helicopter matched me instantly, maintaining that precise distance. I climbed, it climbed, I descended, it descended. Every maneuver I made, it mirrored perfectly, like a reflection in water. Through the fog, I could see the pilot in the other cockpit. The figure sat in the same position I was sitting, hands on the same controls, head turned at the same angle. I couldn't make out facial features through the distance and the fog, but the posture was identical. I keyed my radio, even though I knew it wouldn't work. Unidentified aircraft, you are in restricted airspace. Identify yourself. My own voice came back through the static, speaking the exact same words with the exact same inflection, but delayed by maybe half a second, like hearing an echo that shouldn't exist. The other helicopter began drifting closer. Not aggressively, just a slow, steady convergence that would bring us together in maybe 5 minutes if I didn't act. I banked hard left, putting distance between us, and the other aircraft matched my turn, but continued its gradual approach. I looked down through the fog trying to find the pipeline, trying to re-establish visual reference to something real and known. The fog parted just enough to show me what was below. Helicopters. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all flying in perfect formation, all identical to mine, all following the pipeline south. They stretched as far as I could see in both directions, a massive convoy of aircraft moving in absolute silence and synchronization. The helicopter beside me was now close enough that I could see into its cockpit clearly. The pilot turned its head toward me, and I saw my own face looking back. But the expression was wrong, too neutral, too empty, like a photograph of me rather than an actual person. It raised one hand and pointed down at the formation below, then at me, then down again. The meaning was clear: join them. I pushed the cyclic forward and dove, breaking away from the formation, heading for the ground at an angle that made my instruments scream warnings. The fog swallowed me completely. I couldn't see anything. Not the ground, not the sky, not the other helicopters. My altitude indicator showed 50 feet when the fog suddenly cleared and I found myself flying over the pipeline again. Normal altitude, normal heading, normal everything. The other helicopters were gone. My radio crackled to life with the dead horse calling my position. Cross, you dropped off radar for approximately 30 seconds. Confirm your status. 30 seconds. I'd been in that fog for at least 20 minutes. I completed my inspection on autopilot, my hands shaking on the controls, and landed at Dead Horse without filing any report about what I'd seen. What would I even say? That was 3 weeks ago. I've flown the route twice since then, and both times the fog has appeared at mile marker 247. Both times I've climbed above it, refused to descend, maintained radio contact, and completed my run without incident. But I see them in the fog below. The formation is growing, more helicopters appearing with each flight, all of them identical, all of them following the pipeline, all of them waiting for me to join. Last night, I saw one land at Dead Horse, watched it taxi to the company hangar, watched the pilot climb out and walk to the operations building. The pilot, who looked exactly like me, moved exactly like me, signed the logbook with my handwriting. I'm in my apartment now, watching the news, and I just saw footage of a helicopter crash near the pipeline. Mile marker 247. They're saying the pilot died on impact, that the aircraft went down in heavy fog. The pilot's name was Nathan Cross, but I'm still here. I'm still alive. I can feel my heartbeat, feel the cold beer in my hand, feel the fabric of my couch, except when I look in the mirror, sometimes my reflection moves half a second delayed. Sometimes I catch myself turning my head toward the window, toward the north, toward the pipeline, with an expression I don't recognize. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of rotor blades even though no helicopters are flying. They're calling me back to the formation, and I'm starting to think I should go.